there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters. Today we are very happy to bring you an interview with Professor Mario Saraceni. The interview was conducted by Matt in Chichester on the south coast of England earlier this summer. Mario works as Reader and Associate Head of Research in the School of Language and Area Studies at the University of Portsmouth. Professor Saraceni's research interests are in the field of English and globalization. His scholarly activities focus on the political, ideological, and pedagogical implications of the forms and functions of the English language outside its traditional cultural base. As well as numerous articles and book chapters, his own published books include 2015's World Englishes, A Critical Analysis, which was awarded the British Applied Linguistics Association Book Prize in 2016, and 2010's The Relocation of English, Shifting Paradigms in a Global Era. Matt spoke with Mario about the research area of World Englishes, as well as other related topics. Enjoy the interview.
Okay, so I'm sitting here with Professor Mario Saraceni in Chichester, and we're sitting outside Chichester Cathedral in a cafe, and it's sunny and hot and
beautiful.
and beautiful. Thank you very much for being here today.
Pleasure.
I'd like to begin, and we usually begin our interviews by asking how you became interested in the field that you work in, namely World Englishes.
I think that it happened when I was doing my master's course at the University of Nottingham, and I was doing this master's course called English Language and Literary Studies. Mm-hmm. This is late 90s, and one of the modules in that master's was World Englishes, and it was taught by John McCrae. I think I mentioned that in the book, and John was teaching us this module that for me was a complete revelation. It was like wow, I never really thought about this, because for me English or English is, even the plural of English was something new, but if I had thought about it, I'd thought about it in terms of Britain and America, maybe Australia, but the fact that there were so many Englishes around the world and so many different varieties and different accents, etc., it's something I never really thought about properly, and that was the spark of my interest in World Englishes, and then it kind of grew from there.
Right.
So we're talking about 1996-7.
Right.
Yeah.
And what was your first kind of what got your interest particularly?
Well, I think it was the fact that first it was the element of novelty that it really interested me, and the fact that this is something I never thought about before. And I suppose that then when I went to after my PhD, which was not in World Englishes,
oh really? Okay.
Not at all. Yeah. After my PhD, I got a job at Assumption University in Thailand, and one of the things that I started teaching there was English in the World and World Englishes.
Okay.
And so, in a way, that was also a more tangible and more important stimulus for me to really get to know this field and become interested in the field. So it's right. One of those things that the more I read about it, and the more I became interested in it. So I think that's how it went. Yeah. So, in terms of timeline, here we're talking about early 2000s, 2001 and 2, etc. So it was that the initial spark was when I was doing my MA, and then, then I did my PhD, which is not about World Englishes, and then I started teaching it, and then that's how it really grew, and developed.
And you, I think you mentioned the word, it was kind of a revelation.
Yeah.
Why was it a revelation for you in that sense?
It was a revelation because, thinking, for example, the fact that there was so much literature like in terms of creative writing, in places like Nigeria and other places in West Africa, or in South Asia, or in Southeast Asia. And some of it was written in varieties of English that were different from what you might want to call standard English, whatever that means. To me, that was part of the revelation, was part of the... I think what strikes most students, and I see that now about World Englishes, is that the idea that there isn't one acceptable English. So the moment you accept and embrace that idea, you then it opens up a whole host of possibilities, and it opens your mind as well. So you start reading, for example, Sam Selvon, etc., and you look at Caribbean English, and this is a book that's been written in that variety, and from someone who's used to thinking about English in terms of one language, just like one Italian or one German, etc. You have to. There's an intellectual almost challenge. It's very interesting that you have to engage with, and that in itself is very rewarding.
I see. I think the first time that I came across a World English in literature was Chinua Achebe's Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which is all about the language and Nigeria and tribes.
Yes. What's really interesting about the book that you just mentioned, and especially about the author, is that, and this is really important aspect of World Englishes, is the idea of making the language your own. So Achebe was a Nigerian writer, and he wrote an essay about that, and explaining what he meant by ownership of English, sort of making this language an African language that was able to express an African experience.
Right.
So he did that, but then a lot of other writers did that as well. Salman Rushdie, for example, just to name a very famous name, and lots of other people elsewhere in the world have done the same thing, have kind of appropriated this language and make it their own. And one of the ways in which these writers have appropriated the language is by quite consciously changing aspects of the form of the language. So making the language different was instrumental to making it your own.
I see.
This isn't an English product or a British entity, but it's an African entity. And the reason, the how I recognize it as African is because I've actually modified it in a way that makes it suitable to the African environment. And the same applies to India and anywhere else. So the kind of conscious and deliberate modification of the language in order to claim ownership of it was something that historically has been very, very important in the development of World Englishes as a ethos. Really.
I see. Yeah. And just to be a bit clear for our listeners, we recently spoke to Jennifer Jenkins, who is very famous and well known in the field of English as a lingua franca.
Yeah.
How do the two fields, World Englishes and TEFL, overlap? But how do they differ in their approach?
First of all, and I think Jenny says that in her interview. First of all, World Englishes. The first difference is, if you like, chronological.
Okay.
So, if you imagine World Englishes as being like the initial field, the initial sort of center of interest around the fact that English isn't just one monolithic entity. Okay. So now that started primarily thanks to Braj Kachru back in the 70s, or even early actually. Well, let's say in the 70s, and then fully developed in the mid-80s, and then continued to go on, etc. So World English is, as the name implies, is very much about plurality. It's very much about the fact that English isn't one thing, right? But it's many things.
Yeah.
So many varieties, to use a better word. Now, the focus of World Englishes has always been primarily on what Kachru called the outer circle. So the outer circle, just to keep it very simple and brief, is the parts of the world that used to be part of the British Empire and have inherited the English language as a consequence. So if you think of Nigeria and India and Malaysia and Singapore and so on. So that's the outer circle, and this is where World English historically has focused its attention.
Okay.
Now, English as lingua franca, as a very similar field. I say very similar because it's similarly concerned with the fact that English isn't, or that does not need to be, just a British entity or an American entity, but it belongs to the world. That's the main similarity. The difference is that English as a lingua franca looks at what Cattro called the expanding circle. So places like Japan, where you are, or places like Russia, or places like the rest of Europe, or places like South America, and so on and so forth. So places where English does not have an historical presence in the same way as the outer circle has, but it has primarily an importance due to the international status of the language. So English, and you're able to communicate with lots of other people from around the world. Right. And so, as a consequence of this, while World English is primarily concerned with differences between this and that variety of English, so, between, say, difference between British English and Indian English and Malaysian English and so on, English as lingua franca is very interested in what actually is in common among the ways in which people speak English around the world, especially in the expanding circle. What is it that actually, what's the core, what are the core features that, that make the ways that people speak English in Japan similar to the ways that people speak English in Thailand? How do they make themselves understood? What is it that they do in order to understand each other? What is it that their English is, or their varieties of English, or the speaking English is in common, or have in common? I think that's.
So it's
I don't know if it makes sense.
It's kind of more concerned with the point in between, I guess, the two speakers, a Japanese speaker and a Saudi speaker, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, if you want to put it in one sentence, you could probably say, and obviously this is a massive simplification, but you could say that World English is interested in distinguishing features, whereas English as a lingua franca research is interested in common features.
I see. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
And you talked about Braj Castro's circles. I forgot what it's called. Concentric circles. Is that
concentric circles? Or circles, just circles. Yeah.
Would you say that was the point where this field took off, or was that one of the catalyst kind of moments for?
I think the circles idea was a very clever way of representing the fact that English played different roles around the world. So it wasn't, not only was it not the same language, but it also played different roles. So the fact that English is the native language for most people in England or America, that's one thing. But then if you move elsewhere in the world and then go to India, now in India, English is sort of an additional language or a second language, or for many people it's actually the first language, but fundamentally within the country it plays a different role. And then again, if you go to Japan, it's a different role again. It's in Japan is very much like a language of international communication more than anything else. So the circles are a way of representing that, and they're also at the same time, and this is very important as well, are a way of representing the historical spread of the language. So the inner, outer, and expanding circle correspond pretty much to different types of colonization. So in the inner circle, you get, apart from the British Isles, you get countries that used to be part of the British Empire, but also where the English language replaced the local languages because of the kind of colonization that went on. So North America, Australia, New Zealand, the local languages were replaced by English because the local people were replaced by the people that came from Britain. Whereas, so they were settling kind of territories. Britain annexed those territories into the empire and then populate is slightly wrong, but in the sense, but replace the original population.
Okay.
And therefore their languages.
Yeah.
Whereas in the outer circle, you have the consequence of a different kind of colonization, which was mainly to do with exploiting these territories, but without necessarily settling in those territories. So if you get a place like Nigeria was part of the empire, but the local people stayed where they were, and their languages stayed where they were, although the relative importance within the country changed. But so that means that the English language became an additional elite language. So the circles represent that as well.
Okay. Where does at what point we use the term world Englishes, but at what point does say for example a Pigeon or a Creole become a self-standing English in itself?
Well, one way in which in the literature people make a distinction between a Pigeon and a Creole is that the Creole is a full-fledged language.
Yeah.
So a Creole, in a way, could be seen. This is quite interesting because there's a recent debate relating to that, because the BBC have recently launched the BBC Pigeon in West Africa.
Okay.
Now, and that it's slightly confusing the way in which Pigeon is used. But if you look at classic sociolinguistic literature, one of the distinctions that they make is that Creole is a development of a Pigeon into a full language, whereas a Pigeon is a kind of short-lived of situation where two groups of people need to communicate with one another and sort of resort to an incredibly simplified version of two languages.
People are born into Creoles as well.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of, so Tok Pisin is a classic example that people refer to when they want to explain what a Creole is.
Right. Yeah.
But having said this, so I think it's interesting for listeners also to know that often the word Pigeon is used almost as a synonym to Creole. So and BBC Pigeon is exactly that example. They talk about Pigeon, but what they are really referring to is a language. It's not some kind of, and that's why they were actually able to codify to some extent this language and made a BBC version out of it.
Right. Okay, so that makes sense. I was wondering if there was any overlap between the study of contact languages and world Englishes.
The TEFLologists have written a book, Podcasting and Professional Development, a guide for English language teachers, details the emergence of the podcast as a tool for professional development, engagement, and personal investment, as well as providing a guide to setting up your own podcast. Featuring a foreword by Thomas Farrell, this is the first book written for language teachers hoping to make connections between the podcasting medium and their own professional development. Podcasting and Professional Development, a guide for English language teachers, is released by the independent publishing collective The Round, which has produced ebooks by Scott Thornbury, Nikki Hockley, Lindsay Clanfield, and many others. For a full list of titles, visit theround.com. Podcasting and Professional Development, a guide for English language teachers, is available on The Round and directly through Amazon, and all profits from sales will go back into producing the TEFLology Podcast. Pick up a copy and support the show.
I want to ask you something that you mentioned in your book, that the paradigm of world Englishes could be paradoxical in a sense. It's kind of striving for diversity, but it's also it questions linguistic equality, and it's kind of non-hierarchical. So is this kind of a paradox in this sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think the paradigm has been incredibly important, very, very important, fundamental in promoting the idea of plurality and, the fact that, as we said earlier, the English isn't just one language, it belongs to the world, and so on and so forth. Where the paradox is, in my opinion, is that what you're doing by focusing so much on distinguishing features, focusing so much, for example, on saying things like, oh, look, this is Singaporean English because it has this use of the plural and this use of the, I don't know, tenses and so on and so forth. And this other thing is Nigerian English because it has this, and that. By doing that, you know, without wanting to do it, you might be creating a ranking order of quality.
Yeah.
So fundamentally what you're saying is, you got British English, and that's called the standard, or American English, or sometimes you have this sort of double standard, etc. And that's accepted. But we need to also look at other Englishes as well. But it's difficult to say that and focus so much on diversity and at the same time promote equality.
Right.
So it's very, you know, to me the paradox is in this continued attention to distinction.
Okay.
To say, look, you know, English spoken in this country is different. The moment you say that, you're also allowing someone who is very concerned with their idea of language equality to say, well, yeah, okay, fine, that's interesting. I'll accept your label, Singaporean English, but I don't want anything to do with it.
Okay.
I want this, which is proper English, i.e. British English.
Yeah.
So the moment you have this spectrum of Englishes and you put a national flag onto each variety and you label them very precisely and you list the features, etc., you're actually creating almost like a zoological
right.
representation of Englishes, and that allows, you know, paradoxically, it allows a ranking order of quality. Whether or not you agree with that, obviously, ranking order.
Yeah. And maybe related to this, there's obviously different ways to analyse varieties of English.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what models are there that we can apply. For example, I think in your book you mentioned errors and or features. Deficit or innovation, and kind of a spot the difference approach.
Yeah.
That's all the terms I could
Yeah.
find.
Yeah.
What could you describe some of those?
What,
models?
yes. When I talk about that in the book, what I'm talking about is this. Related to what I was saying just a minute ago. You know, if you have, let's say, British English or, you know, whatever your idea of standard English is as the benchmark, and then you describe varieties of English on the basis of that benchmark, you end up with what I said just now.
Yeah.
An alternative to that is to go to a place, it doesn't have to be a country necessarily, a community, right? It could be bigger or smaller than a country, and examine and understand how language and languages are used in that community.
Right.
The reason why I'm saying languages is because, you know, you don't have to necessarily just look at one language. People in the world are far more often multilingual than they are in a place like Europe. In fact, even Europe is very multilingual. But you get people that routinely share 2 or 3 or 4 languages, right?
Yeah.
So that's why it's important to look at language use in its totality. That's one thing. The other thing is, go to the place. If you're interested, for example, in how English is used, try and understand the use of English on its own right. And I think I mentioned that in the book as well. One really good example of this is Singaporean English and the kind of study that has been done in Singaporean English, where people have said, okay, fine, you know, if you continue to describe Singaporean English in terms of how it differs from British English, you end with one set of results. If you look at Singaporean English completely independently and try and understand the underlying rules that determine this or that thing that we might observe as a feature, then you end up with a different thing. You end up with a more autonomous and actually a more truthful description of how language is used in a different community.
Yeah.
Rather than constantly comparing it to either explicitly or implicitly to an idealized standard. You know, so to me the 2 things to do, one is that you know, sort of looking at varieties, let's call them varieties of English, more independently rather than in a kind of implicit or explicit conjunction to British or American English. And 2, looking at the use of English together with the use of other languages.
I see.
So the combination of different languages is such an important fact that we can't afford to ignore.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're just presenting a very partial picture untruthful picture as well.
I see. You, in your book, you use the analogy we should be cutting the umbilical cord from like a localized or a geographical English. I wonder if you could talk about what you talked about, a geographical model and a person-based model. I guess you kind of described that just then by thinking about local communities. Yeah.
And I think that the umbilical cord is interesting because I think that idea comes from, we were talking about Chinua Achebe earlier. And Chinua Achebe, he made this big persuasive case of making his English an African English. But one of the things he also said in that same essay was that it was important for him that the English that he was contributing to reforging was still in full communion with its ancestral home, as he put it, right? So this needs to be recognizably English. And I think, I totally obviously see where that point comes from, but I also think that there's an extreme need in the world, especially as it embraces English as an international lingua franca, to see it no longer, and completely no longer, as something emanating from Britain. And that needs to be, to me, that's a really, it's a priority. Because, you can't have a world language that has still its sort of ideological roots in people's minds in a particular geographical place. So if you're using a language as your world language, then it needs to be those roots need to be cut off.
I see. Yeah.
The umbilical cord, metaphorically, need to be severed. Not because it needs to be a completely denationalized language, but it just does not need to continue to carry that association with Britain or America.
Yeah.
Which is very important because it comes with a lot of other ideological, etc., baggage that nobody needs.
I see. Yeah. If, for example, if we do apply like more of a person-based approach, would that not give way to a new kind of speakerhood discrimination? Or
I think what I mean by speaker-based description is that ultimately every single individual has a particular linguistic repertoire. Your linguistic repertoire is not the same as mine.
Right.
Your linguistic repertoire is not the same as your wife's linguistic repertoire, or in fact anybody else sitting here.
Right.
So what's interesting, this does not mean that let's get rid of nationality-based descriptions or etc., but also recognizing the importance of variability within a community. And then fundamentally what people do, what I think what's really interesting, and this is, I think sociolinguistics is moving in this direction, is trying to understand what people do in order to understand each other, given the different linguistic repertoires. So you and I, now at the moment we're using, fairly standard English, because that's what we got in common.
Yeah.
Right? If I spoke some Japanese, or if you spoke some Italian, we would eventually be using those languages too.
Yeah.
Because that's what naturally happens. Well, no, because that is part of your linguistic repertoire, and what that means is simply your linguistic repertoire isn't just an addition. It's not like one language and then you got bits of other languages, and those bits of other languages overlap with the main language or whatever. No, it's just part of the richness with which you're able to express yourself.
Okay.
So if I'm using a word that expresses what I need to say better than any other word, and I know that you will understand that word, I'll use it, regardless of what language tag that word has attached to it. And so how people make use of their respective linguistic repertoires in different domains, in different communities, in different contexts, etc., is really interesting, which doesn't mean that anything else isn't interesting.
Yeah.
But this needs to be looked at, and it is being looked at.
Right.
Yeah.
So so I guess you're talking more on a kind of a micro level rather than a wider kind
So the wider is important, but the micro is also important.
Right, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of staying on that same kind of strand there, in our interview of Jennifer Jenkins, we talked about language policies in international university campuses.
Yeah.
And more broadly speaking, what ideological standpoints are or have been levelled at particular Englishes around the world in terms of linguistic imperialism?
Yeah, I think, you see, linguistic imperialism as a concern is very skeptical of the idea of world Englishes.
Right.
Because what linguistic imperialism says is that fundamentally world Englishes is a fairly naive way of understanding the spread of English in the world, or all Englishes are equal, blah blah blah. Whereas linguistic imperialism says very clearly some Englishes are more equal than others, and no matter what some sociolinguists say about the equality of Englishes, there's some dominant Englishes that are far more powerful. And we're not just simply talking about languages here. We're talking about domination in all kinds of ways, and that is obviously connected to university campuses around the world. It's obviously dominated to the fact that British and American universities are opening campuses, in other countries in the world, especially in what we might want to call developing world, and you see, so it's all connected to this idea of the domination of the few over the rest of the world. And so from a linguistic imperialism point of view, it all goes together. So because there's one dominant language, there's also one dominant ideology, there's one dominant, very restricted set of countries, well, possibly one or two. So the US, first of all, and then, to some extent Britain, but kind of dominating, at least culturally, the rest of the world, and then economically and militarily and everything, and so it's all very interconnected. Now, obviously, the people who have argued against this very cynical, I'm not saying wrong, but let's say cynical view of the world, is that by appropriating English, you can respond, you can fight back, you can say, look, this is no longer your language, it's my language, and I use it for my own purposes. But it's not easy. Certainly, it's not something that can be discussed exclusively in terms of language. Language is very inextricably connected to other drives and other forces that are sort of taking place in the world, and you can't extract one from the other. You can just say, oh, it's just the dominance of English that's causing this. That would be as naive as anything else. It's a combination of factors that are going on, and it's not easy to find a solution simply by resorting to language or language ownership or anything like that.
I think something you said that's rare. Some of the ideological observations are rarely down to the language itself. They're more related to the wider discourse.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, you can speak English and be very, very strongly anti-American or anti-capitalist or anti-anything, or you can't. Or even if you don't speak English at all, you can have exactly the same sentiments. Or at the same time, you can speak English and be very pro-American or not. I mean, so it's not the language itself that is the problem. I think of this, I'm pretty convinced. The language itself on its own isn't the problem in the world domination of one country over the rest. It's far more than that.
Yeah.
But it has a place. It has a role to play. It's interconnected within everything else. But you must consider the everything else, and in order to make sense of it.
I see. Yeah. So perhaps if it's okay, just one final question.
Sure. Yeah.
How does thinking about more of a practical kind of pedagogical level? How does world Englishes or the paradigm of world Englishes play out on that level, and to what extent, if any, are there any paradigm shifts, if any?
I think that But one interesting paradigm shift that has happened recently in Britain is the introduction of World Englishes in the A-level curriculum, for example. That's quite interesting.
Right.
Because it's something that it actually says there's some tangible impact has happened as a result of, because one of my criticisms was that World Englishes scholars are talking to one another about World Englishes and conferences, etc., and journal papers and so on, but all of that discussion isn't really going much beyond that circle.
Yeah.
But I think that things maybe are changing.
Okay.
And I think, the first thing that comes to mind is this. To some extent, what we were saying earlier as well, the fact that BBC is launching this BBC Pigeon is, I think, evidence of something that's going on outside academia.
Right.
And that could have a positive effect. I think the greater the realization that English, as we said earlier, isn't just one or isn't just a British entity, the better it will be for people that use this language in conjunction with other languages, etc., in the ways in which they orient themselves to this language. Because there's nothing more alienating than speaking a language while considering it not your own.
Right.
It's really weird. If you speak a language and you continue to think of it as a borrowed language, as a lot of people do in the world, that to me is something that needs to sort of come to an end. And that will be the greatest impact of World Englishes in the world.
Do you think that the classroom, like the kind of, I guess, the battlegrounds, that's kind of like the front line of all this, where the teacher meets the student?
I think so. I think you're right. It's very clearly, battleground, to some extent. The classroom is a really good place, like a physical space where ideas are generated, where discussions take place, and then in an ideal world, those ideas will cascade down or will propagate, will continue to sort of exist outside the classroom and develop outside the classroom. In many ways, my own experience is exactly that. As we said at the very beginning of this interview, I became interested in World Englishes during my MA. And that's a classic, very good example of someone who thinks or is exposed to an idea and is fascinated by the idea and then sort of works on it and develops it, etc. And I think the classroom, for that reason, is a very, very important space.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much. We'll end it there. But it's been great to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we hope you enjoyed that interview with Professor Mario Saraceni. Just a reminder, you can find our website, which is TEFLology-podcast.com, which has all of our previous episodes. We are on Twitter @TEFLology, and we're on Facebook. You can also send us an email. Our email address is teflology@gmail.com. And of course, if you subscribe and review us on iTunes, we'd appreciate that very much. Okay, thank you for listening, and see you next time.